They literally would unleash death squads to make sure that the people who were living on the $1,200 a year in the tar paper shack would continue to live on the $1,200 in a tar paper shack.
One of the personnel who were involved in persecuting and later framing Geronimo Pratt was also involved in the fabrication of evidence to convict Leonard Peltier. This was an FBI agent by the name of Richard W. Held.
Well, Richard the Elder, which is Richard G. Held, was basically one of the architects of COINTELPRO.
Strangely enough, both the father and son were involved in the operation on Pine Ridge, which led to the frame-up of Leonard Peltier on murder charges.
Basically the paramilitary operations of 250 to 300 FBI agents, SWAT personnel, on the reservation for about a 3-month period of time to once and for all break the back of the American Indian movement.
Armored personnel carriers with heavy machine guns, M16s wearing camouflage uniforms, overflights by Phantom F-4 reconnaissance jets and Huey helicopters, and remote sensing devices. It was very much like what was deployed in Vietnam at that time.
When the people went into Wounded Knee, there were chiefs and elders and some of the American Indian Movement members. These were the Oglala people. They didn't have any weapons. They went in there peacefully. They were surrounded with machine guns, armored personnel carriers, so the people picked up arms. And, you know, there were no comparison what the government had. We shot back. It was self-defense.
The government spent nearly $1 billion in the military operation on Pine Ridge. And that's $1 billion in 1975 or 1973 dollars. That's probably more than all the money invested in social programs on that reservation from 1870 onward. A people's movement to control the resources and land on the reservations happened to coincide with the energy crisis. In the Black Hills, there were at least a dozen large multinational corporations, energy corporations involved. And the government purports to represent the people, but it really represents vested economic interests. The movements that are working for positive social change threaten the interests of the transnational corporations, and the government is essentially an instrument of corporate policy.
Leonard Peltier, leader of AIM, the American Indian Movement, had been in jail for 20 years. We finally got permission to interview him. 3 days after we saw him at Leavenworth, he was moved. No one knew where to.
Leonard Peltier is a prisoner of the longest war in the history of the United States. That's the war against the indigenous people of the United States.
And he didn't shoot anybody, and he didn't kill anybody, yet he was convicted because 2 FBI agents had been killed, and somebody had to pay.
The question then becomes, what is he in that cage for? And the answer is to serve as an example of the arbitrary ability of the government of the United States to repress the legitimate aspirations for liberation of Native people, all Native people. He serves that purpose. So long as he's there, even though it's known that he's not guilty of the specific offense which he was convicted.
He's been sentenced to 2 life sentences. But finally they admitted in the last argument of the case in November of 1992 and that they didn't know who shot the 2 FBI agents. They said it several times in different ways without any ambiguity. We don't know who killed the agents. We don't know who fired the fatal shots. And yet here's Leonard Peltier serving these sentences. We're addressing President Clinton to give clemency to Leonard Peltier in the name of simple justice. Now.
Who do you suppose killed Kennedy? The National Security Agency have the hit teams.
The United States Army, of course, has its contingency plans for putting down civil disturbance in the United States. They had these programs in the 1960s called Cable Splicer and Garden Plot for entering onto the scene in the event of civil disturbance in the United States. These activities continued on into the 1980s, but the main agency that became involved on the civilian side was FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
The FEMA has created a great deal of paranoia, probably for very good reason. Their whole reason for existence is to take control and keep things going in time of a crisis of, earthquake or military crisis. In the instance of a military or political crisis, we don't know what extremes they're willing to go to. They've drawn up their martial law plans.
One of the things that grew out of the military contingency planning, such as Cable Splicer and Garden Plot, was the military assistance to the police forces in organizing these and training these SWAT squads. So these are, in fact, outright militarized police units, even though they are civilian. And the United States military, the Army particularly, had much to do with the establishment of these units through the 1960s and into the 70s. Now, I think all the way across the country there are SWAT units everywhere. And they started out in places like Chicago, I believe, and Los Angeles. But they were done with the help of the U.S. military.
Well, Rex 84 was a plan to collect dissidents around the country who might be involved in violent activity and throw them basically in detainment camps. Some people call them concentration camps.
They had, I believe, something like 17 military installations selected in the United States, where they would house up to, I believe, something like 150,000 or 250,000 people in the event that the streets turned to chaos if Reagan had invaded Central America in the early 1980s.
So, despite what the director of the FBI may be saying currently, you can assume that they're still conducting covert operations.
They were going to round up every dissident and every person who took to the street, plus a lot of foreigners, at the same time, because they did not want to have the situation develop as it had against Johnson and Nixon over the Vietnam War. So in the early 80s, Reagan said all he had to, it was all prepared, the statement declaring martial law, suspending the Constitution, and then they could go out and take everybody over to these military reservations, the equivalent of concentration camps, and just hold them there until what he wanted to do was done.
The government is definitely shifting intelligence resources to the private sector. And one of the reasons for this is to escape public scrutiny under a law such as the Freedom of Information Act. Freedom of Information Act only applies to government agencies.
You have to imagine technology 20, 30 years in advance of what we're using today. All that is classified, and it's classified for a very good reason, because it's being put to criminal uses.
Bugging and interception of private communication, the disappearance of privacy, you might say. What's going on now is that there are large private corporate databases that accumulate information on individuals, track their activities, track their economic activities. These corporations would call themselves credit corporations or whatever, but they're essentially intelligence operations.
Please listen, my brother and my sister too. Although these lines may not apply to you, we need less killing, less killing, more chilling. We can reach the pinnacle if our mind is willing. Less drinking, more thinking. What the hell is shocking? Our minds, body, spirits, and our bodies. I mean.